Okay, so in the previous session we were talking about profiles and permission sets. Profiles and permission sets, and basically what we saw was how do you control the access to different components in Salesforce, like objects, tabs. So who should have access to which all tabs, which all objects, which all fields, and which all apps. That's something which you can easily control from the profiles, and in case there are some exceptions to the profiles, you can handle it using permission sets. That part is pretty simple. Now comes the concept of the data, the actual records. Okay, what I'm trying to say is, let's say there are five people, five people in the sales team. Okay, all these five people have the same profile, which means they all will have access to certain objects. Let's say account, opportunity, contact. They all have access to the same objects as per their profile. But there can be a requirement that these five people own a certain amount of data. For example, I own a certain territory and I have my own accounts, and I don't want other four to look into that data. All right, this is basically called the sharing settings. Okay, in Salesforce, every record has an owner, and you have the option of defining the data as private or public. Which means if you define the data as private, only the owner will get to see the data. If you make the data public, everyone in the organization will see the data. As simple as that. You have the option of making data private or public. Private data is something that everyone in the organization, private data means only the owner will get to see. Public data means everyone in the organization will get to see. Got it? So, Salesforce allows you to keep things simple. In case you have a requirement where the owner of a record should only see the data, make the data as private. In case you want everyone to see the data, you have to make the data public. Now, this private or public needs to be defined at an organization level. You cannot say that you will make my data private and the other person's data public. If you're making the data private, you will have to make the data for private for the entire organization, or you will have to make it public for the entire organization. Okay, this concept is called OWD, organization wide default, which means the private or public setting that you do has to be applicable on the entire organization. Where do we do this setting? Just quickly log in and show it to you. Yep, here we are. Sharing settings is under security control, so you need to go to setup, security control, sharing settings. Here you need to go, and in sharing settings, the first option that you get to see is organization wide default. That's what I was talking about, OWD. So in OWD, you basically have to define for each object that for which object you want to keep the data as private and for which object you want to make the data as public. Okay, and it's on the object, it's not for an individual user. So if you say my contacts are private, then throughout the organization contacts are going to be private, which means only the owner of the contact will get to see that contact. Other people will not have access to contact. If you say my contacts are public, then throughout the organization everyone will get to see everyone's data. Simple. You can click on edit and change the OWD setting for any object, right? So you can keep some objects as public, some objects as private, depending on what sort of data you have in that particular object. Okay. Now, so under sharing settings, we have this concept of OWD, as I said. So basically what happens is either you make the data private for everyone or you make data public for everyone for any given object. And that's what we are doing here. You have the option, all the objects are listed, you have the option of making a certain object as private or public. Now, think of a situation. If the data is public, then it's fine. Then there is no problem. Everyone gets to see everyone's data, which is a pretty simple thing. Okay, so you just want to keep the data open. Everyone can see all the data. That's absolutely fine. But think of a situation where the data is private. Let's say we have made the data private. For example, we have made the accounts and opportunities private, which means get to see my accounts and opportunities. Okay, let me give you a scenario. I get to see my accounts and opportunities. No one else in the organization can see my accounts and opportunities because we have made the data private. Okay. Now, think of a situation if if there is a situation or if there is a requirement that I will be on leave for 2 weeks. I will not be there in the company for 2 weeks. I'm going on a leave. And the company wants someone else to look into my data, take care of my records. How will you do that? Because my data is private, only I get to see that data, right? So for that reason, there's another option which is available, which is called sharing rule. Now the sharing rule comes into picture only if you have made the data private. Okay, if the data is public already, then there will not be a scenario arising here, because if the data is already public, then you don't have to give additional permission to anyone. Only if the data is private, someone needs to access the other person's data, then only sharing rule comes into the picture. Okay, so sharing rule basically allows you to define exception to OWD. So the sharing rule will allow you to define exceptions to your OWD. Alright, how do you do that? Under the same sharing settings, just below OWD, you will see the sharing rules option. Yeah, just below the OWD, you have the sharing rule option. So if you want to define an exception to the OWD, you can always define a sharing rule for that, for account, for opportunity, for whichever object you want. For example, uh, you want my opportunities to be shared with someone else, then you should define an opportunity sharing rule. If you want my accounts to be shared with someone else, then you should define account sharing rule. But again, as I said earlier, sharing rule comes into picture only if in the OWD you have made data private. If the data has been made private, then only other people will need special permission to access my data, right? If it is public, then there is no special permission required. So for that reason, sharing rule does not have any role if the data is already public. It makes sense, or it comes into picture only if the data has been made private earlier. So let's assume that opportunities are private and someone else needs to access my opportunity. So all that you can do is you can just go to opportunity sharing rule, define a new rule. You just have to give the rule name, and you have to define which data needs to be shared and with whom it needs to be shared. Okay, so which data needs to be shared, you can pick that based on a record owner. This particular person's data needs to be shared with this person, or you can select it based on some criteria also. Let's say you want to say that, okay, all the data from a certain country. Let's say we are talking about opportunities here. Okay, so let's say you say that all the records where 20 is greater than 20, something like this. You can basically go ahead and define any particular criteria. So all those opportunities need to be shared with someone else, that can be done. Or if you just want to share the data based on a record owner, that can also be done. you just want to say that, okay, data of Eastern sales team needs to be shared with international sales. So this can be done basically, VP of international sales. So this can be done, right? So this is how you can actually define exceptions to the OWD. And as you can see here, you can use sharing rules only to grant wider access to data, not to restrict access. Okay, so that's what I said a couple of times just now, that sharing rule is being used for giving additional access. So someone who does not have the access by default through the OWD needs access, can be given through sharing rule. So this will come into picture only if the data is private. If the data is kept public, which means everyone can access all the data, then no one needs additional permissions. Got it? So that's how the sharing rules would work. Alright. So the sharing settings has two concepts. One is making the data public or private through OWD. In OWD, we are actually defining a rule for the entire organization. Okay. Uh, and we're making the data public or private for the entire organization. In case you keep the data public, then you don't have to worry about anything. Then there's nothing else required. Everything is open to everyone. But in case you have made the data private at some point in the OWD, and you need to define some exception on that, then you can use the sharing rules to define those exceptions. Right? Now, the next concept that I want you to understand is a role. Okay, what is a role? Role is basically your organization hierarchy. The hierarchy of your organization. Now, why do we need to define that here in Salesforce? How would we actually? Why would we need that? Organization hierarchy means basically, when you are in an organization, when you have different users are at different hierarchy level, right? Now, Salesforce gives you the option of defining the hierarchy for the users. Basically, which means that, let's say if I'm a sales representative and then there is another person who is a sales manager, Salesforce allows us to define the hierarchy and assign the roles to each user. So that Salesforce can understand that how the hierarchy structure is, who is the subordinate of whom, who is the manager of whom. So that sort of thing Salesforce can understand. Okay. Now the question comes into mind is, why would we need that? Do we really need this sort of a setup? And if yes, why? So how will hierarchy actually help? Hierarchy helps because sometimes when I say the data should be made private, think about it. When I say data should be made private, I don't want to make it completely private. I want to say that data should be made private in terms of the other people in the same hierarchy level should not see the data, but the manager should see. For example, consider an organization. Let's say this is the head of the business. Then there is head of sales, and here is marketing head. Okay. Under sales, let's say there are three people, three different territories. This is the head of territory 1, territory 2, and territory 3. Okay. Under this territory again, if there are, let's say, 1, 2, and 3 people. And so on. Let's say there are 3 people here, 3 people here. Alright. Now when I'm saying that data of this person should be private, sometimes I might mean that data of this person should not be accessible to these people who are at the same level. For example, there are more people here at this level. Okay, so sometimes your requirement is not making the data completely isolated. You just want that other people at the same level should not get to see the data, but the manager should see. Got it? So for to have this kind of a setting, what is the first thing that you have to do? First thing that we have to do is we have to make our Salesforce understand that who's the manager, who's the subordinate, who's at what level. Correct? To make this kind of a model work, this can be a situation, right? Your opportunities, other person who is at the same level should not see it. That's fine. But at least your manager would want to see what opportunity you are working on, what is the status and all. And your manager's manager will also want to see, and this person will also want to see what you're doing, right? So to make this process work, it's important that first of all we define the hierarchy. Otherwise, how will Salesforce understand who is manager and who is subordinate, right? So only if you have this kind of a requirement that the data needs to be shared with the managers and not with other people, only if you have this kind of requirement, then you should go ahead and define the role hierarchy. Okay, if you don't have that requirement, then you don't need the role hierarchy concept. So where do we do this? Defining the roles is pretty simple. It can be done in your manage users. You go to setup, manage users. Under manage users, there is this option of defining roles. Okay, here you have the option of setting up the roles for your organization. So every company has a different hierarchy structure, right? You can define your company's hierarchy structure. By default, there is a structure CEO, CFO, CEO, this kind of thing. So it's there by default. You don't have to use the same structure. You can remove the ones that you don't need. For example, you feel that there is no SVP customer support, go ahead and delete it. If you want to add something, you can add it, right? So you can set up your own company's structure. You don't have a CFO, delete it. Basically, just go and add something else, or you can edit it. Instead of CFO, you have someone else. Just go and edit the name. Got it? So this way you can define the hierarchy structure. Again, as I said, this role hierarchy structure will come into picture only if you want to manage things based on hierarchy. That my the other person who is at the same hierarchy level should not see data, but my manager, his manager, and all these people should see my data. Then only this thing comes into picture. Okay. If you just want to keep the data public, which means everyone will get to see it, then also this role hierarchy doesn't make that much of a difference. Okay. So anyhow, if you have to keep the data public only, then why to define hierarchy and all that stuff, right? Okay. So once you have defined the role hierarchy, at every hierarchy you can assign user. So basically assigning who is the CEO and all. A hierarchy structure or the tree of the hierarchy is defined, but you also have to specify who is the CEO. So you can actually go to this and assign a certain user as CEO. For example, this is CEO. Okay, correct. So that is. If you go to users now, you get to see that the role is assigned CEO to this user. So this way it can be defined. Got it? Okay. So, and that's what we saw in the sharing rules also. If you go to the sharing rules once again, sometimes you can define the sharing rule exception based on hierarchy also. You just say opportunity sharing rule, for example, and you want the data of VP International Sales to be shared with VP Marketing. You can do that. Okay, so sometimes it is a requirement also that you want two teams to work together and you just want the data to be shared between them, right? Instead of making all the data changes and all these things, instead of making the changes into all these things, what we can do is we can just allow two teams to work together in case the data of the entire organization is private, but for a couple of organizations it's sorry, for a couple of people it needs to be shared, or a couple of teams need to share the data amongst them. You can actually go ahead and do this through the roles, right? Okay, so that's basically about the role. Okay, there's one more thing that actually works with the role is on the OWD setting. We have an option of grant access using hierarchies. Okay, in case you have defined proper hierarchies, and if the grant access using hierarchy is selected, even if you make the data private and grant access using hierarchy is selected, then the manager will get to see subordinates data. So based on hierarchy, it's gonna grant the access. So that's, that's how it's gonna work. But if you don't select this, if you turn it off, then even the manager will not get to see the data of the subordinate. Okay, so that option you have, that choice you have, whether you want to allow the access through hierarchies or you don't want to allow the access, through hierarchies. That option you have, to check the checkbox. You can check it or you can not check it. It completely depends on you. All right, now if I click on edit, there's something that I want you to notice. I just said that you have that option, checking or unchecking. Unfortunately, you don't see that uncheck option. Do you see this? You see this option? No, right? It's checked and it's grayed out. What does this mean? What does it mean?
These are default objects. We can
Standard
grant
object.
access for the custom objects only.
Right. That's what it means. So these are all standard object and the setting that is there cannot be changed. Okay, which means for, in other words, if I have to put it, I'll put it this way, that in case you have hierarchies defined, in case you have hierarchy defined for your organization and you have data in a standard object, your manager will always get to see the data that you own, even if the data is private, for standard object. Okay, so for standard objects there is no way you can hide your data from your manager. Your manager will always have access to your data, even if it is made private, still your manager will have access. That's what is defined here. Okay, so what do we do if we need to store some data which is completely isolated, no one gets to see, only I get to see, even my manager doesn't get to see? For that you have to make sure that you are putting the data in a custom object, because for standard objects Salesforce by default has given access through hierarchies. If there is no hierarchy defined, then it doesn't know who's manager. Got my point? So but if the hierarchy is defined, then your manager is always gonna get to see your data. Alright, so a few things that we have talked here, let me just put things into perspective once again. First requirement is whether the data for a certain object needs to be made public or private. You decide whether you want to keep the data as private or public. If you think the data is important and it should not be shared unnecessarily with everyone, then you can keep it private. For example, just think of a situation. Practically think about it. Let's say I have 100,000 accounts. Let's say we are running a business and we have 100,000 accounts, and we have 100 sales reps. Okay, and we have some 100,000. Each sales rep has 100,000 accounts. I have 1,000 accounts for each sales rep. Okay. Now tell me one thing. Would you like to expose all 100,000 accounts to all 100 sales reps? Do you want to do that? These sales reps can be of different territories, different kind of industries and all. Is it a good idea? Just think functionally, don't go into the technical aspect, but is it a good idea to show all 100,000 accounts? What do you
No,
think? To everyone? No. Why it is not a good idea? Why do you think it's
because
bad?
we want
Hmm.
because we want to show the data which is valuable for the representatives. If it is not of like falling under their scope, then what's the need? It would be a kind of it would can create a kind of confusion for them.
It can create confusion. It's a threat also, unnecessarily exposing all the data. Let them see what they need. One day it can be confusing. Absolutely correct. 100,000 records if the person sees and he just has to work on 1,000 records, what is the point showing him 100,000 records? Unnecessarily the guy gets confused. Instead of working on his own account, he starts calling my account by mistake, by intention, or whatever. Secondly, I'm actually putting my data also on risk. Data is what? It's the biggest asset of a company. For preparing that database of 100,000 accounts, or all the valuable information which is associated with that 100,000 accounts, the company has actually spent a lot of money on that, a lot of effort in that. Will the company be interested in showing all the data to everyone? So both the ways, it's not a good solution. It's not helping the sales rep. It's not helping the company also. Got it? So that's the reason why the company might not want to show all the information to everyone. But again, coming back to uh, okay, fine. So we understand, through concept that sometimes it does not make sense for the company to expose all the information to everyone. Okay, there can be certain objects where it doesn't matter. Like for example, campaigns. This is a campaign object, and you might want to show all the campaigns to everyone. There is no problem. I mean, there's no very important or very confidential information. It's just about your marketing activities, the dates. You might want to show that, or the solutions. But you might not want to show the cases to everyone. So that that ways it depends. So we understand that sometimes the company might want to keep the data private. Private means only restricted to the people who need to access that record, who are the owner of the record. Fine. Now, other option is keeping public, but if it is kept public, then you don't have to worry about anything. Something which is public, it's anyhow public. Everyone gets to see that. So we really don't have to be worried about that part. The problem arises when you have made the data private. If you make the data private, then what will happen? Sometimes someone else who does not have access by default will need to access it. The reason can be anything. One reason, as I said, the person who wants the data is going to be on leave or something like that. The other reason is the person who is senior or the manager of that person needs to access it, right? Third reason can be there are two teams who work in sync with each other, right? So because when you make it private, it becomes private for everyone. Then even a small access needs to be given by you, right? So a customer support team and a sales team work together. So the data needs to be shared with the customer support team. So there can be requirements only if the data is made private. If it is public, then there is no requirement. Nothing needs to be done. Only the problem arises when it is made private. So when it is made private, you can have several situations. Like someone who does not access needs access. Okay. Someone who does not have access needs access, but if that person is a manager or something, if basically is on top of the hierarchy, then grant access using hierarchy, or the other option is sharing rules. So two options. So we have two options. One is give the access through sharing rule if the other person who needs access is not on top of the hierarchy, then you can give the access through sharing rule. If the person is the manager by default in the hierarchy, then grant access using hierarchy should do the trick. Got it? So that's how it is. For everything else where it's not the manager in the hierarchy, it's going to be sharing rules. Okay, only for people on the hierarchy who are actually the managers as per the hierarchy, grant access using hierarchy is going to work. Alright, so both these things are coming into picture only if the data is private. Alright, now there's one more scenario. So when the data is private, someone needs access who is a manager, grant access using hierarchy is going to work. Now data is private, someone needs access who is not a manager or not in the hierarchy. Sharing rules is going to do the trick there. Now there is one more requirement. Some people in the company, let's say there is a person who is reporting analyst, is not on top of the hierarchy also, but he needs to see everyone's data, or think of a database administrator. This is a person who will actually be doing the data import, export, update for everyone, basically, for the entire organization. Now, these kind of people, they need access to everyone's data. No matter whether you have made the data private or public, but these people will need access to everyone's data. Correct? So there will be certain roles or certain people in the company who will need access to everyone's data, irrespective of the fact whether uh, the data is private or public or grant access using hierarchy is there or not. These people need to access all the data. Okay. Now, how do we manage the permissions that these people need? Okay. So for these kind of roles, there's something called a data admin permission. Okay. So these kind of roles who basically need to be kept out of the sharing settings and all, they need to be given data admin permission. Okay, data admin permission allows them to have access no matter what the sharing setting is. Okay, so in data admin permission there are two permissions: view all and modify all. Does anyone remember where did we see this? We have seen this view all modify all earlier. Where did we see this? Anyone
While
remembers?
while creating objects and fields,
Where?
while creating objects,
While creating object? No. In profile. In the profile, when you give the object settings, there view all and modify all options were there. Okay. So a view all permission, data permission basically allows the user to see all records in the object, and a modify all permission allows the user to modify all the records in the object. So anyone who has a view all and modify all permission will not be affected by what is the sharing setting. Okay, so if there are 20 people in the company, let's say you all are there in the company and I am also there in the company, and the uh, sharing setting has been made private, which will mean that each one of you will only get to see your data, the data that you own. Okay, or the data of your subordinate. That's it. If grant access using hierarchy is done, you'll get to see your data and the data of your subordinate. But because I'm the database administrator, I need to see everyone's data. Then the company can give me a view all permission. So view all permission will allow me to see everyone's data. Okay, where it is given, it's given in the profile actually. To go to profiles, we created a custom profile, right? See, view all and modify all. Okay, so anyone, for example, anyone has a view all permission on account means this profile user can see all the accounts. Doesn't matter what is the sharing setting for account, what is OWT, it doesn't matter. This person will see all the accounts. The same way as someone who has a view all on opportunity will get to see all the opportunities for everyone, right? So these are, as I said, these are data admin permissions, data administration permissions. View all and modify all. Check this box. This is a view all thing. Check this box in the column. In this column, if you want users with this profile to have view access to all records of the selected object type, regardless of the sharing settings for the object. So regardless of the sharing setting of the object, the users of this profile will have access to all the records of this object. Same thing applies for modify all, but in modify all, basically the user will have option to modify all the records. He can delete, he can update, he can create, that's all. View all will give him only read permission for everything. Got it? So because every company will have some these kind of roles, some people who are who would basically need the access to all the data, database administrator, reporting people, maybe sometimes the person who's doing the testing, that sort of people, right? So for them we will have view all or modify all permission. For rest of them, sharing setting is good enough. Make the data private or public. All right. Now let me know if anyone has a question or doubt here. There are a lot of concepts that we have actually talked about or we have learned regarding this access and permissions. Just try and keep it very simple. See, first is in case the profile permission sets. These are all options available to you for controlling the access and permissions. So all that you have to do is whenever you have a requirement, you just have to look into what kind of requirement you have. Okay, and then based on that you will have to take a call. What is the right approach for going about it? For example, if I want to restrict a tab access for a certain user, what is the best way I can do it? I want a certain user not to see a tab. What should be the approach? What is the option that you're going to use? Tab permission
In the profile.
in the profile, right? So any permissions related to the components, tab, apps, objects, fields, these kind of things is done through profile, right? So any component permissions are through profiles. Okay, so something like an app or tab. So whenever you have a requirement, your client says that, hey, you know what, these users should not have this access or these users need to have this access in terms of these components, then profile is the option that you have. Now in case one user needs some additional permissions which are not there in his profile, exception to profiles. So what do you do for exception to profiles? What is the other option that we have? Permissions.
Permission set.
So the component permissions and the exception to the profiles, through profiles and permission sets, we are actually able to handle this. Right? Now, if the concept is about controlling the access to the data, if it is about components, it's pretty simple. You just go and define in the profile what all components the person will have access to. If it is about data, if it is about records, that you should see my data or you should not see my data, that's purely sharing settings. So in sharing settings, we have talked about two concepts. One is OWT, one is sharing rules. OWT is basically making the data as private or public. Okay. Sharing rule is again defining exception to sharing rule is again defining exception to this thing. What do you call it? OWT if it is private, set to private. If it is set to public, then there is no need for sharing rule also, right? Under OWD, you have the option of grant access using hierarchy, which will allow the access to your managers. Okay, so in case you have a requirement of allowing the access to managers, so you don't have to go to the sharing rule, you can actually use the option grant access using hierarchy. Grant access using hierarchy is the option which is by default selected for standard objects and you cannot turn it off, which means for standard objects the access is always granted based on the hierarchy and you don't have an option to change it. Alright, so that's basically about the record or data sharing. And then we come into the data admin permission. There will be people in any organization who need access to all the data, who need access to all the records. These people need to be uh, given some special permission so that they don't get affected by sharing setting. So there are certain people who you want to keep out of the sharing settings. For that you have view all and modify all. That's it. That's all we have to do. So if we just understand profile permission set, there is one more terminology which you can actually keep in mind, which is called field level security. Though it's a part of profile only, but I just want you to remember the terminology field level security. So if you just know this much, you know everything about controlling access and permissions. So either it will be done through profiles, permission sets. If it is about record, it will be done through sharing settings. If you have to make it private or public, OWD. If you have to allow some additional access which is already private, sharing rules. You want to allow access through hierarchies, grant access using hierarchy, data admin permission, view all, modify all. That's it. These 6 to 7 lines is the summation of the entire discussion that we had in our last 2 sessions. Right? I'm just gonna uh, copy this
Ranjit,
part.
what if we need to?
Just one quick moment. Uh, I'm just going to copy this in this like 6 7 lines. I don't want you to get confused with other things. In case you guys need, you can just copy it and keep it with yourself. I've just put it in the chat window. You can copy it and keep it with yourself. So this is just the crux of the entire discussion. Right? Okay, guys. Now let me know if anyone has any questions.